Hello and welcome to our first video on the Romantic period. For this video we are going to be covering the introductory section to the Romantic period, as well as Chapter 1, which is right after that. It begins right here. Then we will also be covering Chapter 2, which is Romantic Composers and Their Public. It's dealing with the relationship of composers and musicians as to how they found employment in this rapidly changing world in which they were living in. And then we will discuss this very short chapter on the art song. And I will preface that by saying I already have a video on the art song. I just recently added it on my YouTube channel. If you are one of my students, you have access to that link on Blackboard underneath Romantic period videos. If you are stumbling across this video on my YouTube channel or are a subscriber or something like that, then you probably already saw this video. This is an older video that I made a few years back, and I had it on my old YouTube channel, and I since recently have put it on my newer, more active channel. So check that out, because that's going to do a really good job of covering the bases of some characteristics of the art song. The only thing they've really changed in the textbook is at the end of this video you will notice it talk about the different types of formats for art songs, namely whether or not they are strophic, through composed, and stuff like that. In the current text they don't really address that. That's more addressed back when they initially talked about form, and quite honestly it's not a huge part of the discussion of art songs, at least not in the circles that I've discussed it in. You end up discussing more the what the song is about, and some of the other characteristics like the relationship between the piano accompaniment and the singer and stuff like that. So there's a little more important things to focus on. So that's the only thing about this video that's a bit outdated. You don't really have to memorize like what strophic and through composed and stuff is at the end of the video. However, that is always good stuff to know. Knowledge will always serve you well. So we're going to go over those basic chapters. The first quiz on the Romantic period includes coverage of Chapter 9. I do skip around a bit because Chapter 1 does discuss program music. I usually also assign that chapter, which is Chapter 9. And then we skip over into Chapter 11, which is Nationalism, which is also discussed in Chapter 1 under the subsection Nationalism and Exoticism. So we will be looking at those chapters probably in the second video on the Romantic period. Unless if I feel like I really can squeeze it in this one. I do try to keep my recorded lectures under an hour, if at all possible. I have a few that are a little longer. I have a few that are less, but we'll see how it goes. We'll see if we can cover those chapters as well. As usual, I do have study guides for you students. This one can be found in the Romantic period section, and as always with most of my videos, I do try to put in the comments section if you are not one of my students and you would like to have access to these study guides. They do go in line with the Camian text that we use, which is Music and Appreciation from McGraw-Hill. So they do go in line with that. It'll do you best if you have that. And this particular study guide, I'm probably not going to go over it point by point like I do in some of my other videos. We will be looking at this first question and second question here and answering those to kind of get us started. But for the most part, I'm going to actually use the textbook and kind of go through that like I would in an actual class. So let's get started with the second question here, because that's the easiest to find and quickest in the chapter right there, right off the bat. So the dates of the Romantic period. If you recall, the classical period ended in 1820, so that's where we're starting. and you will see the dates are here, 1820 to 1900. That's the generalized dates of the Romantic period. Now, you may find other textbooks, some encyclopedias, things like that, may actually have slightly different dates, but usually most agree that, by the time you get to the turn of the century, that you do enter into, once you enter into the 20th century, things begin to, especially definitely by the second decade of the 20th century, things are radically changing. And that's going to be one of the things once we eventually get to the 20th century, is we're going to see rapid progress. We're going to see cultural movements no longer lasting several decades. Instead, they sometimes last less than a decade. But that's the pace of the modern world. After all, if you look at the dates of between, say, the Wright brothers, first flight in the 20th century, it's only 66 years later that man is putting his foot on the moon. So that's rapid progress there for you. We are going to see that there are some rapidly changing things in this period as well. I think composers and musicians were aware of how accelerated daily life was becoming, especially in the cities where you had, railroads, transportation was easier than ever before, steamboats and stuff like that. I mean, the daily life was beginning to accelerate up to the speed it's going to hit in the 20th century. And it was a dramatically changing period. We're going to see there were lots of revolutions. We saw at the end of the classical period, the French Revolution being the most pivotal change in Western Europe. And that's why we tend to kind of put a little bit more emphasis on the French Revolution as opposed to the American Revolution. Although the American Revolution was similar to the French Revolution in that it was common people sort of revolting against the higher estate of the monarchy, the French Revolution really affected more Western Europe, and we are still in Western Europe and discussing Western musical culture. If you recall, that's why we're focusing on Western Europe, because our modern day music traditions are founded way more in Western Europe than they are, say, ancient China or somewhere like that. Matter of fact, if you look at the timeline of events here, you see that the Monroe Doctrine was established, of course named after President Monroe of the United States. Basically, that was a sort of an isolationist doctrine. We decided in America to really not get involved too heavily in colonial European affairs, focusing more on our own infrastructure and so forth. Of course, all that ends at the end of the Romantic period with the Spanish-American War, where we literally go to war with a European power. And, if you want to read up, this is one of the most I think, appreciated events in American history. The Spanish-American War did a lot to change the U.S. international politics. And even the way that we entered that war is a bit sketchy. So read about the USS Maine and the explosion that happened on it, and even read about how journalism played a big role in that war. And that's something we're still seeing today, especially the big role of journalism. Even the Vietnam War was started over very questionable reports and stuff like that. So anyways, the U.S. is not going to contribute much at all during this period to Western musical style. Good reason for that is, again, our kind of isolationist views, and also combine that with the fact that we're still trying to find our voice musically. We do see the rumblings and the beginnings of what would become America's contribution to the music world. Of course, we gave the world jazz and then later on rock and roll. But that doesn't come till 20th century. We do see the evolution of, say, ragtime and things like that eventually led to the creation of jazz. After all, it was a ragtime pianist from New Orleans named Jelly Roll Morton who boldly claimed when he moved to New York City that he invented jazz. Of course, that's easily debatable. But, you do see the beginnings of jazz and ragtime as well as some other things. So that's going to come later, though. You see America's sort of still finding its voice. It's not to say we don't have some musical traditions that don't develop here, but largely throughout the 1800s, America is still very much in the European tradition, at least as far as trained musicians. Most of our music that we're playing over here is foreign music from Europe. That's not to say we don't have, some American composers and contributions. As a matter of fact, some of the greatest music schools, which we're going to learn are called conservatories, are founded here in America. Carnegie Hall, a great performance hall, opens up during this time. And even Tchaikovsky, the great composer, comes over and conducts a concert at its initial opening, performing some of his works, including the great 1812 Overture. So we do see America involved, but they're not really producing quite yet unique music enough for us to kind of focus on its composers and musicians. So we're still going to be focusing largely on Western Europe, especially with all these revolutions you see going on. There were some coming out around 1830, and then later towards the middle of the century, you do see further revolutions spreading throughout Europe. Now, not all of these revolutions were purely democratic, but most of them did see a move towards giving more power, influence, and finances to the common people. We do see the middle class, so to speak, rise up, and part of this was due to the Industrial Revolution, providing factory jobs. Industry is what helps bring greater financial stability and wealth to the middle class. They began to, what they started in the classical period, they began to crave some of the finer things in life. They want their own music, they want their own opera, they want their own, whatever, literature. And I think that you will find that the Romantic period, despite only being 80 years, is an extremely prolific period in all the arts. And we were actually going to be looking at some of the reasons why that is. So, moving on, we do have a few other questions here to answer. Like I said, number one, Romanticism is a cultural movement that stressed three things. And there are three basic things that are stressed in Romantic, in the Romantic style. And this goes for, of course, the paintings. You can see this in the paintings. That's why you often see paintings and architecture and things like that in the beginning of your textbook before you ever listen to any music. You are introduced to this. So this was an all-encompassing movement. It included literature, poetry, music, all the different art forms. But you can find right in the first sentence of the introductory section the three things that Romanticism stressed. They're right here: emotion, imagination, and individuality. Now I'm going to quickly go over a brief explanation of what these mean. Obviously, all of you should know what emotion, imagination, and individuality are, but how do they apply to art? Okay, so emotion. The main reason we put that in there is not to say that, Mozart and Bach didn't have emotional music, because they did. After all, that is sort of the purpose of art, is to say what we cannot say with words, to express the human condition, the human soul, the human thought, the human heart. It's kind of hard to call something art if it doesn't express some kind of feeling or thought, or especially emotion. We are generally, as humans, drawn to our emotions. We have a very intimate relationship with our emotions. We make often very irrational decisions because we are emotional beings. And that's what I want to get at. If you recall, the previous period, the classical period, was the age of reason. It was the age of logic and that rational side of your brain. And you can see this even in classical compositions, how balanced they are, how one musical phrase logically leads to another. Now, we do see in Beethoven a beginning to depart from this whole idea of logic and reason. With Beethoven, and even Mozart to some degree, you start seeing a shift, if you will, to being, not always having to be so logical and rational, that sometimes you can just do the unexpected, and in the name of expression and emotion. And after all, who wants to live their life totally rational? I mean, wouldn't that make you kind of like more like a robot if every decision you made, every thought you had was completely rational? Think about some of the strongest emotions we feel: grief, love, sadness, happiness. That these are things that we all experience, and these are things that all unite us. And keep in mind that romanticism, it's kind of spurred off by works like Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, where at the end, in the final movement, you have themes of friendship and unity, and let's put an end to this infighting and constant division among us. Let's not see humans as divided among nobles and commoners and clergy and stuff like that. Let's all come together in the name of friendship. And of course, that's more of an emotional thought of society than it is a logical one. Because, you use your logic and reason, you can assess the world around you, and you know that there will always be groups. It is quite idealistic to think that all humanity could be united equally. But that appeals to our emotional side, our irrational side. And the Romantics weren't afraid to do this. Matter of fact, they stressed it. So it's not to say that the Romantics were particularly good at being emotional. It's just that they had a different philosophy of it. They weren't afraid to be too emotional, or they were kind of rebelling, if you will, in a way, against the logic and reason of the classical period, where everything had to be, have formal balance, and there had to be a logical reason why you go from this key to that key or something like that. Romantics were like, well, I want to go from this key to that key because it kind of it produces a feeling. It's just they didn't really have any logic or reason to it. They were guided definitely more by their emotional side than their logical side. Now, imagination should be pretty easy to figure out, and of course it's somewhat tied to this. All three of these are sort of tied together, by the way. If you are allowed to create works without any rhyme or reason, if you will, not everything has to be logical, then you are free to think up whatever you want. I think you see this beautifully in children. A child, you ask them to draw an animal, chances are they are going to, probably not draw it exactly as it is in real life. They may draw an elephant, but they may decide to color it in pink, even though pink elephants don't exist. Or sometimes if you ask them to draw an animal, they'll come up with an elephant with a duck bill or something like that. They are using their imaginations because they haven't quite been, drilled into them that the world is only a certain way, and that that there's this scientific kind of rational approach to things, and that childlike fascination with the realm of imagination was very much a characteristic of this period. It also had to do with changing social norms and stuff like that. What was considered proper or not proper subject material, that begins to decline as more and more artists are creating art for themselves or the general public. They no longer have to worry about being so refined and elevated, and they're not creating so much for the aristocracy and the church anymore, more for themselves and their people. So they're allowed to express certain subjects. The only real exception to that in this period is, well, have you ever seen dresses and bathing suits from this period? Sexuality was a bit repressed, I would say, in this period. Matter of fact, some of the sexual revolutions that happened in the 20th century, I think, are a direct, kind of reaction to this period. But outside of sexuality, you have a lot of works that focus on things like the occult. You have, witches. We're going to be looking at a piece by Berlioz that has a movement in it called, I think it's Dream of a Witch's Sabbath or something like that. And as a matter of fact, Francis Goya, a painter of this period, This is from a piece of his called Which is Sabbath. And here you have very occultish, pagan, well, not really pagan, but I guess some people would say almost like Satanistic, kind of imagery here. It's definitely an exploration of the macabre and the dark and the forbidden. This stuff is not really what you see. All the other paintings we've seen that deal with religious or the supernatural themes have usually been like Jesus and the cross and stuff like that. Very, very much founded in Christianity. And this period, we see artists begin to use their imaginations. It's not necessarily, because they're like sacrificing babies to Satan or nothing. It's just that they're, for hundreds of years, they've only been allowed to explore, certain things. So now they've got some freedom, and they're going to be exploring, the macabre, witchcraft, all kinds of things. And not all of it has to be dark imagination kind of stuff like that. I mean, you can have clouds in the sky. You can have even a reimagining of the Middle Ages is going to be something we're going to see, where instead of, basically hired mercenaries, knights become these noble, chivalrous people in shining armor and saving damsels in distress. And of course, that's not what the Middle Ages was like. Knights were more like the grasshoppers in A Bug's Life than they were what you see painted in this period, which is why sometimes we refer to people having a glorified, idealistic, emotional view of things like that as a romanticized view. That's where we get the name of this period. Please do not think that romantic is used in the same light as, say, when someone buys flowers and chocolates for someone on Valentine's Day. That's not necessarily the kind of romantic we're talking about here. That is definitely, appealing towards the emotional side of us. But when you think romanticism, think not just, flowery feelings of love and stuff, but really just great emotional expression. Think of this great use of imagination that we talked about. And then we're going to focus on this last one, individuality. Now, this is pretty big. This sort of started with Beethoven. You can pretty much see a lot of the Romantic period start with Beethoven. I've even seen some music appreciation texts classify Beethoven actually as the first Romantic composer, and they don't even include him in the classical section like this text does. Now, Beethoven definitely put some of his own personal thoughts and experiences into his works. And that's what we call subjective, kind of approaches to creating art. Let's distinguish that from objective. You have subjective and objective. Subjective is when you put your own personality into your thoughts, opinions, or art, or whatever. Objective means that you try to remove yourself and see it from exactly what it sounds like, an objective point of view. And a good example of that is, let's say you look at this painting right here, the Raft of the Medusa, and let's say that you just don't like it. It doesn't do anything for you. And yet the person sitting beside you says, "Oh, man, are you kidding? Like, this is an amazing piece of art." That's a subjective point of view. That is something that you two could argue till you're blue in the face, and neither one of you would really be able to objectively prove whether or not this is a good painting or not. So when it comes to personal taste like that, that's a good example of like subjective viewpoints. Now, if you're both critiquing a movie and the movie is just really badly made, let's say the boom mic keeps dropping down into the frame or something like that, like there's something objectively wrong with it, it's just sloppily made, and the filmmakers should have done a better job. Well, that's something that anybody could observe. It doesn't matter really if you're the particular person making that observation or not. So that's more of like an objective point of view. So when we talk about individuality, we talk about composers really being able to insert more of their personal lives into their works, their personal feelings and thoughts. You start to see art become a lot more political. As a matter of fact, this particular painting here, Raft of the Medusa, is actually, believe it or not, very politically charged, because this is actually about a real life event. that occurred where someone was put in charge of a boat because they were of noble birth, and therefore they couldn't serve, as a common crewman. They were instead put in charge of a boat, and despite being told by more seasoned sailors that you should not sail through this one particular part of where they were sailing because there were treacherous rocks there and stuff, the guide decided to do so anyway, and the boat crashed, and a bunch of people died. Here's a few of the survivors that managed to survive, and yes, these are deceased people on the raft. No, they are not keeping them on the raft so that they can give them a proper funeral. They are actually having to resort to cannibalism. And these people, it's horrific stories that have survived from this. These stories were published in newspapers all across Europe, and this was a story that, again, helped lead people to want the aristocracy out. They were tired of people being put in positions of power and influence who were not qualified, did not earn that position. And, that was just the fervor that was engulfing Europe at this time. Now, that ends up impacting a lot of artists, too, because remember, up to this time, most of the art and music and things like that have been supported by the aristocracy or the church. But these higher estates in society are becoming overthrown by the common people. After all, it was the French Revolution that saw, 98% of the population was revolting against the upper 2%, because they just weren't being represented. They didn't have a voice in their society. They didn't really have much of a control, despite being the vast majority of the population. So we do see, and by the way, if you look very carefully, you can see the rescue ship. That's why they're all, kind of waving and freaking out, because that's the ship that ended up rescuing the few survivors. So you do see, of course, politically charged paintings and stuff like that. Now, this is not something new. This is Death of Socrates. That's actually from the classical period. This is Jacques-Louis David, a French painter. And by the way, I had to give a little plug here to an excellent YouTube channel called Nerd Writer. And he did this amazing video. I'll try to remember to put the link in the description. About this particular painting and some of the things about it. Now, we can see some stylistic differences between the Death of Socrates and, say, romantic paintings like this. First of all, with this particular painting here, we see that it's an event that is political. I mean, obviously, Socrates, living back in ancient Greece, has, what does a guy in France in the 1700s, what does that have to do with him? Well, Socrates was somebody who spoke out against the injustices of his own period, and basically he was given a choice between exile and drinking hemlock, and which is a poison. And he ended up choosing to actually die for his beliefs. So, someone, wrapped up in the French Revolution or something, you may be called upon to sacrifice yourself for your ideals and beliefs. I mean, isn't that a great test of how much you actually believe in something? And would you be willing to lay down your life? Now, you can see the formal balance in here. Not only, I mean, you have some very classical period, kind of form and balance, elegance. You see this idealized view of Socrates, who has a very fit body here, when in fact, if you use your logic and reason, we know that Socrates had a very plump nose and a pot belly. Like, he was not an attractive dude by all accounts. But, we're painting him here, the beauty of his spirit, the beauty of his teachings, and what he, represents. And we represent that with this very fit, attractive body here. You see a little bit of that in this painting here, because everybody here, for the most part, looks fairly well developed and stuff. I mean, nobody here is particularly ugly or anything, but at the same time, you do have, like dead bodies on the, and this would have been seen as way too disgusting and revolting, I think, for most classical taste. And you do see, greater contrast between light and dark, things like that. There's definitely some romantic attributes here, but the painter of the Raft of the Medusa was definitely allowed to put a lot more of his own political beliefs, despite the fact that we do see painters like Jacques-Louis David in the late classical also doing the same. You do see art become a lot more political, and if you even recall from Amadeus, Mozart got called in to get a lecture by the emperor because he was worried that some of his stuff might be a little too political. All right, so we are going to see that those three things, emotion, imagination, and individuality, are strong attributes. Okay? Now, a few of the other paintings here we need to look at. This is a portrait of Chopin, who we're going to end up actually covering. He is a Polish composer who is most known for his piano compositions. He wrote almost exclusively for the piano, which is something we haven't really seen up to this point. But that also shows you the sort of liberation, if you will, of the artist of this period. They are pretty much free to write whatever they want to. Now, granted, they still have to make a living. We are going to see that many of them had side jobs. They didn't just sit around just writing music all the time. For the most part, they did what Mozart and former composers like Bach did. I mean, they often taught. Chopin was a very well sought out teacher for piano. I mean, why not pay high dollar for one of the best pianists of your day to do that? And one of the things we're going to learn about Chopin is Chopin was, despite being an extremely gifted pianist, was actually he was never quite comfortable playing for large crowds and stuff. I think from what I've read about him, he was a lot more comfortable teaching or playing to a small group of people than he was a large concert hall. So you are going to see, due to the increase of literacy and due to the fact that now paper is so affordable and cheap due to the Industrial Revolution and things like that, you do see new job opportunities open for composers. Like Robert Schumann was a very well-respected music critic, and a lot more of your middle classes now are reading newspapers and things like that, and they are wanting to learn more about which concerts to go to, just like movies are today. Chances are you're not going to you don't have the time and money to see every single movie that's made, but I don't know how you are, but if I see a movie trailer and a movie looks really good, I sort of wait until I read a review of it before I actually go see it, because movie trailers are designed to do just that. They're designed to make movies look amazing, and we've all seen movie trailers that made a film look like it was going to be just definitely worth your time and money, only to actually go to the movie and be like, my goodness, I want my $8 and my 2 hours back. So reading reviews is a good way that you can check out what someone else who usually knows more about film and watches them more often, they're a more qualified person to assess whether or not the film is any good or not. Okay, so we also see, of course, teaching positions, because there's these new music schools, art schools that are open up called like conservatories, things like that. And of course, positions open up for musicians and composers to teach at those, like Tchaikovsky teaching at a conservatory in Russia. All right, this painting right here gets really confused a lot. I have a lot of students that think that this is slaves in the American South, but actually it is painted by a French dude. And if you look at the name of the painting, it's called the Gleaners. And if you don't know what gleaning is basically an old system of welfare they had, where when you would harvest a field, like a wheat field that you see here, any of the stalks that fall out of your like basket, or you can actually see the big cart here that's full of wheat. If some were to fall off or something, you were to actually leave it and usually the outskirts of the field sometimes. Like if you had a vineyard or something, you had to leave those unharvested, and this allowed for the unfortunates in society, usually like widows, orphans, and stuff like that, people who really couldn't provide for themselves. They were allowed to come and glean the field. So these are not slaves, but they are basically on the bottom rung of society. These are very extremely poor people living in extreme poverty, and they have to go and glean the fields afterwards. Now, this is a very important painting because up to this point, we've mostly seen paintings depicting people in society that were usually of the nobility, the church, or some kind of, class above, the common people. For the first time, really, in art and society, we are seeing the working class being represented a lot more in art and stuff like that. That's not to say you can't find some medieval painting or fresco or something that doesn't depict, normal everyday life, but we're really starting to see this become a focus of the Romantic art forms. There's literature, there are paintings, there's even pieces of music that sort of celebrate and point out aspects of daily life, including those of the poor. And this is a theme that we will see go further into the 20th century, where often it is poverty, themes of poverty and hard work and backbreaking labor, how hard and difficult life is, how cruel it can be sometimes. These are definitely themes that you start to see develop. And if you go back to the classical period, about the only tales of hardship that you see and stuff like that, especially like if you go back to the Baroque and stuff, I mean, most of that comes from like Greek, mythological tales, that are from ancient Greece and stuff. And, that it's hard for common people to identify with gods and, demigods and stuff like that. The aristocrats could identify with those because they were in positions of, they were powerful people. They basically were like gods and demigods. But now you're starting to see a much more realistic, approach to representing life and the struggles of life in Romantic art. Okay, moving on. We're going to kind of skip over a few of these. Now, we do see a couple paintings here representing the focus of nature, too. Nature was something that people began to express in art as a thing of beauty, probably because you now have so many people moving to cities. And, when you live in the city, you kind of feel like you're not as connected to nature as much. So many artists, and this, again, can be harkened back to Beethoven. Beethoven loved to go out on country walks. I mean, Beethoven loved nature, and you see that continued into the Romantic period, where nature and things like that, like for instance, on our chapter on program music, we're going to have a piece of music written by a Czechoslovakian composer named Smetana, and it's about going down a big river that goes through Czechoslovakia called the Moldau. Basically, if you think of how like the Mississippi dissects like the eastern 1/3 of our country and here in the United States, and like how most Americans know the Mississippi, that's sort of how the Moldau is in Czechoslovakia. It dissects the western third of the country, and it's a pretty famous river for them. So you see that kind of connection to nature in that piece is all about like kind of going down the river, and the river is a thing of beauty, or the river is something to be celebrated. The different aspects of the river are communicated. And again, we see with a painting here by an English painter representing a slave ship. If you recall, England abolished slavery before the Americas did. And we see this very much abolitionist-fueled painting here depicting a slave ship, and if you look very carefully, you can see the slaves in the foreground that were dumped overboard, because that's the main criticism of this, is that slavery, this is the greatest injustice of slavery, is that it dehumanizes people. It makes people, disposable, and doesn't, they're not treated with dignity and respect. And of course, he ends up using a lot of colors we don't associate with the sea. You end up having a lot of reds and oranges, things like that, instead of the traditional like blues and greens, more soothing colors. So this brash use of very alarming colors and stuff, and notice the somewhat violent brushstrokes and stuff like that. This sort of foreshadows like impressionism and things like that, where it's more about the basic, it's not so much about the purity of form and structure and depicting things like a photograph. It's more about doing what art can do, and that's transforming your view of the real world and transforming it through some kind of medium to represent the thoughts and ideas and emotions that you want to express. So and keep in mind too, in the Romantic period, actual photographs do develop, which began to transform paintings, because why should painters strive for realistic detail anymore if you can achieve such detail through a photograph? So you are actually going to see some photographs of some composers for the first time instead of just portraits, like Chopin and Brahms and people like that during this period are going to you're going to see actual photographs. All right, so we want to just kind of peruse through chapter 1 here. Individuality of style is a big characteristic of Romantic period music. This is true. This is why we spend a lot of chapters talking about composers. If you recall from the classical period, we spent a lot of chapters talking about forms, the formal structures that the composers use to kind of frame their musical ideas. And we only had 3 real composers of the classical period, Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, that we focused on. Now, there were hundreds of great composers in the classical period, but I challenge you to look up some of these and listen to them. There's a lot of them that sound like Haydn, a lot of them that sound like Mozart, and a lot of them, even later, usually after Beethoven, because he was such a revolutionary, but you find people that sound like Beethoven, and that's because they used a lot of the same forms and structures. Now, if you recall what I've already said about the Romantic period, it was not a period based on logic and structure and stuff like that. That's not to say that some didn't use forms, because some, like Mendelssohn and Tchaikovsky, definitely continued using the classical forms. And even like Brahms and stuff like that. Like, you look at his symphonies, and they're definitely draw a lot of inspiration from the classical period as far as their form and structure, but as far as their scope and their expressive qualities, very much Romantic. And again, guys like Chopin wrote almost exclusively for the piano, whereas other composers, focused more on opera or something like that. So you do see a lot of individuality of style. This is why we have somewhere around like 13 composers we're going to be looking at and giving you characteristics of their own music. It's very important that you become a little familiar with a composer, their life, their kind of stylistic elements, because each composer is going to be quite different. Now, there is a typo here, by the way. This is not Nationalism. That's obviously a typo there. Expressive aims and subjects. You, again, start to see with the Romantic period themes that are very expressive and outside the boundaries of what would have been acceptable, elegant, elevated themes of the classical period. Here we have another Goya piece of artwork. And it's called The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters. And you see kind of like owls and, what's this, a lynx down here or something like that? Bats, and not just any old bats, but these giant bats with these demonic heads and stuff like that. So very expressive, occultish kind of themes here. We also have, again, The Witch's Sabbath by Goya. And of course, one of the most famous and disturbing pieces by Goya, this is Saturn Devouring His Son. And of course, it's not talking about the planet Saturn, but the ancient god that's named after, that the planet is named after. And here we have him devouring his son. Now, compare that to the Renaissance painter Rubens. This is pretty disturbing here too, but this is rather tame, and even Saturn has kind of an idealized body here. You definitely are supposed to be disturbed by this imagery here, but Goya's is even more terrifying, and alarming, and is going for less of an idealistic approach. It's going more for the raw emotion and expression that you have there. So you do have expressive aims and subjects during this period. You have pieces of music that expound the boundaries of form, expound the boundaries of dynamics. All the elements of music are in bolder, more brilliant colors, if you will. All right, nationalism and exoticism. Basically, nationalism, if you look at it, it's not the same thing as patriotism. A lot of students confuse patriotism with nationalism. Nationalism is about not necessarily preserving. I guess it was a way of preserving, but using your home country's identity within works of art. Things that are unique about your country or homeland. Now, because of the increase of travel and the fact that, you had cultural centers like Paris, France was a big cultural center at this time, you do end up having a lot of composers that travel a lot, as well as end up being sort of, expatriates of their home nation. For instance, Chopin, always considered himself Polish. His name is actually French, and he actually would relocate to France, but his birthplace was in Poland, and his mother was Polish, and he always considered himself Polish. So Chopin would use Polish elements, Polish dances unique to Poland, like the mazurka and the I've heard it pronounced polonaise and polonaise, I think is, I don't know, there's different ways of pronouncing it. When I do my chapter on Chopin, I'm going to remind myself the different pronunciations and definitely make sure we get those correct. But, he used, Polish elements into his music. Now, of course, the flip side of that is exoticism, where you would use a foreign, exotic country's culture in your works of music or art. A good example of that is Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker, and we will probably examine that more closely when we talk about that. Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker, of course, takes place around Christmas time. Long story short, there's a section where the gifts of Christmas underneath the Christmas tree come to life, and some of these gifts do very short little dances, and they are represented not so much by the gift, but a country that would be associated with the gift. For instance, there is a dance of chocolates, but because Spain was the primary country that colonized South America, where the cocoa bean comes from, and therefore chocolate, without Spanish people bringing back the cocoa bean, you wouldn't have chocolate in Europe. So Tchaikovsky wrote the Spanish dance. If you look at the way the most of the ballet productions design chocolate, they're usually dressed in traditional Spanish garb, and the music sounds Spanish. It has like castanets in it, and tea is Chinese, coffee is Arabian, and there's all these reasons that these exotic nationalities were inserted into a Russian composer's work. So that's an example of what we call nationalism and exoticism. And there's reasons why during this time people started having nationalistic, pride and stuff like that. A lot of it had to do with, for the first time, the formation of, sort of the modern countries of Europe as we see them now. It also had to do with, even the Napoleonic Wars and stuff had influence on this, as even France itself, while it was going through its own revolution, a major concern of that, and one of the main reasons you had Napoleon Bonaparte arise as a dictator despite being a champion of democracy, is that France was really worried about foreign powers coming in and taking advantage of their civil war, basically, to take over the country. So you had a lot of these revolutions going on. You also had greater concerns that, our country's going to lose its identity. There's a lot of fear of that. There was also, like I said, a lot of traveling going on due to steamboats and railroads and things like that. People were able to travel more quickly and cheaper than ever before. And that's where exoticism probably comes into play. That, and of course, you've got the colonial powers like Britain and stuff like that. Germany, I mean, they were starting to colonize exotic locations and bringing back exotic stories, exotic products, things like that. So, yeah. So that's kind of why you see these two movements expressed in Romanticism. Now, program music, like we said with nationalism, we're going to have a chapter dedicated to that. It looks like we're already 50 minutes in, so I'm probably going to make a separate video on nationalism, exoticism, and then program music, which is chapters 9 and 11. We're going to try to get through chapter 3 only in this video. Now, program music is the opposite from absolute music. Absolute music is music just for music's sake. There is no specific picture or story in mind. When you listen to, say, Beethoven, his first symphony or something like that, I mean, or even some of his piano music like Moonlight Sonata, like Beethoven never called it Moonlight Sonata. That was something added on later. So you might think of like moonlight flickering on, a lake or something like that while you listen to it. But Beethoven actually never told us a specific image in mind for that first movement of his sonata that we often call the Moonlight Sonata. Now, program music is the exact opposite of that. Program music has very specific ideas or stories or poetic imagery, whatever, in mind when you listen to it. And the composer will specify that. And this is going to give birth to new forms like the program symphony, which is in the general format of a symphony. It's written for only the orchestra, like a symphony is, but there's usually a story attached to it. Now, Hector Berlioz, a French composer, we're going to look at his program symphony called Symphonie Fantastique. And in that, he actually provided a story because actually he wrote that piece of music to impress a female so she would go out with him. It was a British actress named Harriet Smithson. And with a name like Harriet Smithson, she must have been a hottie, right? But anyway, he writes this basic story about a rejected lover. And in the story, oddly enough, he ends up killing the beloved because he overdoses on drugs. He doesn't overdose on drugs and stuff like that. So, very strange story, but there is an actual story that you're supposed to read in the program. If you've ever been to a classical music concert or play or something like that, you probably were given a little bulletin-like piece of paper that is called the program. And that's probably where we get this name program music, is that the story or literature, whatever. And by the way, the stories are not always made up by the composer. Sometimes a poem by, a poet or something like that, someone other than the composer might be used as the inspiration. But that is what program music is. Program music can even be included like modern day film music and video game music and things like that. Can be used essentially as program music because they are designed to evoke, they're associated with very specific images and things like that. Now, one of the things that we'll stress when we do talk about program music is the use of themes. And that is a musical idea that is to represent a character, an object, a place, or something like that. For instance, in Star Wars movies, whenever Darth Vader's on screen, just about, you hear usually his theme, bum, 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 ba-dum, bum, ba-dum. And usually, the shark is around when you're watching Jaws because you hear that little two-note theme. Ba-dum, ba-dum, and that's where we kind of see the modern contribution of like program music, is because film composers and video game composers and TV composers, they often employ that thematic use that we see first appear in like program symphonies and opera and stuff like that. So, as a matter of fact, I have a video on my channel too. If you check it out, I'm not sure, I can't even remember what I called it, but there's a video on how we use like the Star Wars movies, kind of teach us about how program music works and how they transform themes, like, you know, they'll play the theme happy when the heroes are winning, and then they'll play the theme sad when the heroes are losing, and things like that. So be sure to check that out. All right, so expressive tone color. We have here a, let's see, where is it? Do I still have it pulled up? Yeah, picture of the Toronto Symphony Orchestra, I think. We do see the expansion of the orchestra during the Romantic period. Now, this is sort of a modern day, I'm sorry to say romantic. This is a modern day orchestra. And if you were to go back in time and say, see Mozart conducting an orchestra of one of his symphonies or something, then you would notice that there really wouldn't be this many percussionists. There wouldn't be this much percussion. You wouldn't see bass drums and snare drum. You wouldn't, you know, you might see a glockenspiel occasionally, like in a magic flute or something, but you wouldn't see like a gong, an exotic instrument like that. You would see timpani and maybe some cymbals. But outside of that, your percussion section would be significantly smaller. But it is the Romantic period that the percussion section begins to grow. And like I said, with the gong, you do see these exotic instruments start to appear. You see more percussionists being employed. You also see a huge increase in the brass section, not so much by, you know, that there aren't pieces with brass up to this point, but you do see brass get to do a lot more. And if you recall on my video where we covered the brass family of the instruments, or maybe we covered it in class, if this is a seated class that's watching this, you may recall that I said it was around the 1830s before brass instruments were readily available with valves in most parts of Western Europe. Now, there is a famous Trumpet Concerto by Haydn, but that basically was a prototype kind of trumpet that did have valves, and not all composers had access to that. However, by the time you get to especially the middle of the 1800s, you have composers that are able to write extensively for the brass section. And they are able to play a lot more chromatically, melodically, and things like that due to valves. You also see instruments like the tuba start appearing, and even composers like Wagner that we're going to look at in this period actually were instrumental, no pun intended, in having new instruments develop like the Wagner tuba and instruments like that. So you do see an expansion of the orchestra, more instruments. Your woodwind section will kind of stay the same, usually written in pairs, although you do see some pieces of music call for even more than just pairs of woodwinds. You also see bassoons, contrabassoons, English horns, sometimes even like bass clarinet and stuff like that may start appearing in later, you know, works, and some of the works of the early 20th century. You know, kind of being foreshadowed in that your orchestra is getting bigger and more instruments are being developed. Now, it is true that I believe it was the late 1800s that the saxophone was invented, but by this time the orchestra really wasn't in need of any more woodwind instruments, and some composers did sort of start playing around with it, but it never really quite caught on in classical music. However, jazz musicians started, you know, early saxophone players like Sidney Bechet and stuff started making it a popular jazz instrument. All right, so we have the expansion of the string instrument, probably most felt in the basses. More double basses are added for that exploration of the lower register that you saw composers like Beethoven and Schubert, you know, explore the kind of lower register. So you have generally more cellos, more basses, and to help balance it out, you're going to probably have more violins and more violas. So those are some of the big changes in the orchestra, and because of that, you also have greater dynamic ranges. You see down here, composers begin to write almost a near ridiculous number of F's and P's within a piece of music. So you will see these extreme changes from super quiet, like so quiet that you're more likely to hear an audience member shifting around in their seat than you are the instruments playing. And then you're going to have parts where the orchestra is playing so loudly that you can almost see the brass instruments, you know, just having their tongues, you know, stick out of the bells of their instruments because they're playing so loudly. So you have those extreme dynamics and things like that. That's due to an increase in the size and scope of the orchestra, as well as better made instruments. You start to see, because of course, you know, the technology is better in this period, you start to see Some of these, where's my picture? There it is. Some of the woodwinds and stuff having these extension keys added, and of course flutes are more commonly made of metal at this time, which makes them hold pitch better. They're able to play in their upper and lower registers more in tune. And so you start seeing composers take advantage of greater technology. Even the piano, which its full name is pianoforte or soft loud. That's the whole gimmick with the piano, is that you can play a keyboard instrument either softly or loudly, which the harpsichord and organ really couldn't do. Even the piano begins to increase in range as well as dynamic ability due to the cast iron frames that are used. The strings are able to be stretched even tighter, which means that you can get more quiet sounds out of them as well as louder sounds. And of course, they started adding felt more to the hammers and things like that to make the piano sing a little more. And you start seeing piano composers like Liszt and Chopin take advantage of the greater dynamic ranges and physical range as far as register of the piano. So a lot of cool stuff developing. Basically, it's technological improvements, increase in size and scope. All of this leads to not only an expanded range of dynamics, pitch, and tempo, but also can help contribute to very expressive tone colors because you have now more instruments to choose from. As you can see here, the woodwind section, took on all these new sounds and stuff like that. Composers really started to approach orchestration, which is which instruments you choose at which point, as a serious study and art form. Some of the books, like Berlioz's book you see here on modern instrumentation orchestration, I mean, stuff like that. I mean, they became the book on how to write for orchestras, because in the past, Mozart, for instance, would have been kind of limited to just having the strings do most of the work and then use the woodwinds for contrast. He really couldn't do a whole lot with brass other than, just add punches here and there. Unless if he had access to an extremely gifted soloist or something like that, but not a whole section. And again, the percussion was limited to pretty much just timpani in most of the time. So, composers are very restricted. It's kind of like, back when they made computer games on the old computers. I remember when computer screens, most of them only could do like one color. It was like either blue or green or something like that. I mean, you were limited to doing monochromatic, graphics, because that was the limitation of your technology. But nowadays we have monitors that can produce, so many more colors, thousands, if not millions of colors. And, that's why you can't really adequately compare a modern day video game with, say, a video game in the early 80s, because the technology was so different. So moving on here, we also have colorful harmony. Now, we have talked about the use of chromaticism in the past. You see chromatic tones, which are tones outside of the given key, if you will, used in pieces by Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, even going back to Bach and stuff. But they usually have really good reasons for using these, and they usually didn't use them to cloud your sense of key. Throughout the Baroque and the Classical especially, you had real meaning in your keys. If you even recall how much time we spent talking about sonata form in the classical period, we put a lot of emphasis and stress on the relationship of the keys between the two primary themes in sonata form. Now, as you approach the Romantic period, you see that the sense of key, the sense of that tonal center, began to weaken. Composers were not so much focused on staying on a particular key, because again, they were not thinking about their compositions more in a logical, rational fashion. They weren't thinking, I kind of want to go to A minor here, but I can't really use A minor because we're in the key of D flat major. They were not thinking, so rational that way. They were going to chords because they sound, of their emotional impact and stuff like that. And they weren't afraid to use chromatic harmonies. And this began, again, to cloud your sense of key. Whereas in the past, this was only used to mainly create like tension and instability. You start to see composers use it to just be generally more expressive, and it doesn't necessarily have to be seen as a negative thing to use chromatic harmony. So That's an extremely quick, brief, sort of superficial explanation of that. But just listen out for that in pieces of music, and you'll notice that even when we talk about some of these new forms that develop, we're really not going to be talking about, well, you start in this key and then you go to the relative major, and you don't really talk about it that way. It's not how they thought about harmony for the most part. Okay, the miniature and the monumental, pretty easy to describe there. Most romantic works tend to either be great undertakings that artists would slave over for months, sometimes years, to write them, and other pieces were relatively short and written relatively quickly. The example you have for the art song, for instance, was written in a matter of minutes, and it's a relatively short piece of music by Schubert. However, some of Schubert's symphonies he worked on for very long periods of times, and they're, of course, obviously much more, with that longer form. Now, we have seen this in the past. We see, when we talked about forms in the classical period, we said that, some of the smaller forms like minuet and trios or theme and variation, they could be a small self-standing work, or they could belong to larger forms that had movements in them. But in the Romantic period, you see definitely a kind of separation between little, well, I don't want to use the word little so much, but kind of little miniature little pieces, and that usually involve just a few performers. And then you've got these big monumental, like operas and stuff. And some of these long form compositions, like symphonies and operas, begin to be grander in scope and last longer. I mean, Mozart wrote a few operas that were kind of long, like 4-hour operas and stuff. But my goodness, in the Romantic period, there's some that are over 6 hours long. And you also see like the idea of cycles, which, when you read the chapter on the art song, you'll hear them talk about song cycles. Now, song cycles are basically, and let's just skip ahead there so you can see that. Song cycles are songs that are related in scope, either story or something like that. Think of like sequels in movies, how like you can watch the first Lord of the Rings movie, The Fellowship of the Ring. It's definitely a self-contained movie. It has a definite beginning and an end, but you're really not getting the whole story unless if you watch the two sequels that follow. So the same thing goes for songs and even operas. A very famous opera cycle that the German opera composer Wagner wrote was the Ring Cycle, which actually is based on some of the same myths and legends as Lord of the Rings. So you do start to have this kind of idea of expanding the forms, and Beethoven was really the first to kind of explore this. If you look at his Ninth Symphony, he actually ends up quoting the first and second and third movements at the beginning of the fourth movement, which was kind of unheard of. And so you see this idea of connecting, your pieces of music with things like that. Now, I'm not going to really be able to do Chapter 2 justice because we're already over an hour. Basically, the main thing you need to get out of Chapter 2 is that the aristocracy are on their way out. Now, granted, you saw some of these revolutions didn't hit parts of Western Europe till the middle of the century. And even some composers like Tchaikovsky were living underneath the aristocracy their entire lives. The Tsar, basically the king, Tsar is basically the Russian word for Caesar or king, in Russia ruled all the way up until the Bolshevik Revolution, which didn't take place till the early 20th century. So, there are places where the aristocracy were still in power, or either were just weakened, in their finances and their influence. Some, but maybe weren't, like King Louis XVI, maybe weren't beheaded and violently overthrown that way. But you do see that composers and musicians start to take notice of the change in society, and fewer of them are relying upon the aristocracy and the church and some of these old ancient organizations that used to have rule of society. They're depending much less on those stations and more on the general public. Now, obviously, music is a luxury. If you have to choose between buying food for today or buying music, you're probably going to go with food. So, obviously, music and all the arts tend to gravitate towards the more well-to-do in society. So obviously, it was the upper middle class that probably took advantage most to these free artists that they were now. And for the most part, musicians were allowed to work freely. They were not hired under contract anymore. Remember, Bach was thrown in jail for a few months because he was being so disobedient and stuff. I mean, that's kind of the absolute control that the aristocracy had over their servants, if you will, that worked for them. Now, that's not how Drake and Lady Gaga and people like that work nowadays. I mean, they're not, some of them may feel like they're slaves to their contracts they sign with record labels, but we're even seeing in our day and age a freedom from record labels. I mean, Chance the Rapper just won, I believe, like, what was it, best album? And he's still unsigned as far as I know. Macklemore was unsigned when he did Thrift Shop and stuff like that. So we're actually, I think, going to see even a continued liberation of the artist, if you will, even in our own day and age. But the main idea of a free artist is that you are allowed to write whatever you basically feel like. Now, the old system was you got a commission, you got a work order to write a very specific kind of piece, and you had to cater that piece to whoever commissioned it or whatever audience it was going to be. This is why, so much music of the classical period sounds so refined and elegant and stuff, because it was mostly written for the aristocracy. Composers of the Romantic were a lot more free to basically create art about whatever subject matter they wanted, and, were a lot more free to basically, do as they please. And so when you see the free artists being spoke of in this chapter, that has many levels of freedom that they talk about there. Outside of that, you did have certain things that were in place in society that kind of help ensure the livelihood of the artist. Of course, artists, like we said, rarely just sat around and composed all day. They often had side jobs, like Schumann was a music critic, Tchaikovsky was a music teacher. But, a lot of times they were free to write music, and some composers like Schubert even never heard some of their music. There was a lot of music Schubert wrote that he never got to actually see organized in concert and stuff. He wrote it because he just felt this inner need to write music. He felt like it was what he was put on this planet to do. So you do see a transition in the way art and music are supported at this time, and it sort of ties into what we have today. For instance, if Drake, if you go on like iTunes and you buy a Drake song for like 99 cents, you're not going to help fund his diamond-studded, pool that he has in his backyard. That 99 cents is not going to help him out a whole lot at all. But if 50 million people do that, then now you're talking about some serious money. So that's why you also see most of your important composers and musicians gravitating towards cities, like we saw at the end of the classical period. Keep in mind, all three of your great classical composers, they were often called the Viennese school because they all lived and worked some in Vienna, Austria. But you do see them pretty much depend on gravitating towards cities because they need a large group of people to support them, and they do rely more on the general public, especially the upper middle class, the educated that wanted finer things in life. But you do see the music begin to transform in style. It speaks more to the common people. Folk melodies, commonly sung folk songs, and even sometimes folk legends and stuff like that were used in some of the stories for like operas and stuff like that. You start seeing it appeal less towards the old estates, like the aristocracy and the church, and more towards the common people. And that leads us to the final chapter, and you can see it's a really short chapter. I'm not going to go over every small characteristic of the art song. There is a video that I recently uploaded about the art song, so check that out. I do plan on doing a better video on this because this is an older video that I simply moved to my newer channel. So be sure to check that out. It should be, if you're a student of mine, it should be on Blackboard, or if you're just stumbling across this video on YouTube, you can just click my channel button underneath this video and then look for this particular video on the art song. Just basically, art song is one of those kind of forms that develop more in the Romantic period, and it's possible it developed out of people wanting to be able to perform like opera arias or oratorio solos and stuff like that, and within like the home or like a small intimate evening party, in the upper middle class home or something like that, where basically you have someone on piano accompanying a single singer. And that's going to be the easiest way to identify an art song, is that you have just one singer and you have them accompanied by the piano. Now, don't think that the piano just does the job of providing the harmony, because it actually does more than that. For instance, your example that you have, and you have to look in chapter 4 for the example of art song, even though we don't cover chapter 4 in our first quiz on the Romantic period. Here you see the piano comes in, you have this kind of figure before the singer even sings. And if you notice the translation of the first line, who rides so late in the night through the night and the wind, and you find out it's a father holding his sickly child, riding desperately on horseback, trying to find the doctor. And but before the singer even tells you there's a guy riding on a horse, you hear that you hear that kind of galloping figure in the piano. So think of the piano not just as the accompaniment. It's not like just someone strumming chords on a guitar. The piano plays an integral part, and they usually do it in some kind of introduction, and sometimes there's a little postlude section that the piano may also further comment. You may want to check out some other art songs by Schubert. I highly encourage you check out, I know this looks very childish and this is not the best looking website, but there's an excellent podcast that is called Classics for Kids. And if you don't do podcasts, then just go to classicsforkids.com and do a search for this particular episode here on Franz Schubert. Take Me to Your Leader, and you'll notice that it is pronounced leader, but not spelled like our word leader, which means someone who leads. Instead, this is the German word for songs. If you look, the German word for song is Lied. Now, it's spelled L, where is it? Kind of lost it here. Here. It's spelled L-I-E-D, but it's actually pronounced Lied. Because sometimes in German, when you end the word on a D sound, it gets more of like a DT or T sound. Lieder is the way that you pronounce the plural there. And since Schubert, as well as some other German composers, were very important composers of the art song, sometimes the German word is used. However, there are English art songs, there's Italian art songs, there are art songs in many different languages. But if you do look at the role of the piano and the singer, you do see that it's more than just in a mere accompaniment role. The piano does usually a little bit more than that. Also, you'll notice the singer plays 4 different roles. He has to switch between like singing in the higher register and the lower register. He plays the narrator and the father in the lower register, and then the son and the elf king, which is it's not the kind of elves that you expect, like, usually, not, like if you've seen Lord of the Rings, it's not the kind of elf that like Legolas was, with beautiful golden hair, good guy. Elves in German folklore were usually very mischievous, dark creatures. They were not, very good. So the elf king or Earl King, which is the name of this particular art song, is not a good guy. So you'll see why he's not. You definitely want to read your background information on this song before you watch even the video I've made on it. But the Earl King is a bad guy. He's trying to get the a kid to embrace death, and the kid that's sick, the father is trying to tell him to ignore the Earl King, that he's not seeing the Earl King. It's just mist and his fever that are getting to him. So you'll have to watch the video or either listen through the piece here to find out what happens in the end. Okay? So we're going to sort of wrap up there. Again, check out the Amazing Classics for Kids podcast. If you have an app on your phone like I do, like I use Podcast Addict, you can download all the episodes of this, and they're usually around 5-6 minutes long, and they're really cool. And I've learned, despite the fact that it's definitely catered towards kids, I have learned so much from this podcast. There's so many neat little interesting fun facts about classical music and the composers and stuff like that, instruments, forms, so much stuff you can learn. But if you want to learn more about art songs and what lieder are and stuff like that, check out this short little 6-minute episode from Classics for Kids. All right, so we will save covering program music and nationalism for our next video on the Romantic period. I do plan on getting us all the way through the Romantic period and then the 20th century, and kind of working our way up to how we got the music we have today. So I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope it's been informative. And we will see you next episode.